discussions with more political, high-level engagement. Having widely consulted with parties and groups over the past week, I see work proceeding in the coming days on 3 tracks. First, continued technical negotiations on items under the governing bodies, as well as on the issues forwarded from the subsidiary bodies, into which emerging political agreements may be incorporated. Second, continued presidency consultations, including on the overarching covered decision, as well as on issues I raised during the opening plenaries of the COP, CMP, and CMA as appropriate. And third, ministerial consultations would focus on key outstanding political issues, starting no later than Wednesday. With respect to technical work, consultations will continue on the range of items under the governing bodies in the usual manner, as launched during the opening plenaries of the COP, CMP, and CMA. Information on these consultations will continue to be made available in the daily program and on the CCTV. It is my expectation that the majority of this work will be concluded by Wednesday. In addition, as highlighted by the subsidiary body chairs in their closing sessions on Saturday, there were a number of items under the subsidiary bodies on which parties were not yet able to reach substantive conclusions. Let me now briefly outline how this technical work will be taken forward. I have been informed by Tosi and Marianne that parties need more time to finalize issues regarding mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, agriculture, gender, and response measures. I have therefore asked the co-facilitators, Carlos Fuller and Kay Harrison, to continue to lead the discussions on the mitigation work program, and Andrew Ferron and Leon Charles to help us conclude the second periodic review of the long-term global goal. On the issue of adaptation, I have asked Betuta Latsi and Jens Fugel to continue working on national adaptation plans. Subset Chair Tosi to facilitate discussions on the report and review of the Adaptation Committee, and Kishan Komarasieng and Matthias Fourmier to support the discussions on the global goal and adaptation. On loss of damage, I have asked Lucas Di Pietro and Cornelia Jaeger to continue facilitating matters relating to the Santiago network under the Warsaw International Mechanism. In terms of cooperative mechanisms, I have asked Kuki Sozemeno and Pierre Steinsen to continue facilitating guidance on cooperative approaches referred to in Article 6.2. Kate Hancock and Sonam Chassis to continue working on rules, modalities, procedures for the mechanisms established by Article 6.4. And Maria Ejasi and Jacqueline Rosga to continue facilitating the work program under the framework for non-market approaches referred to in Article 6.8. Sonam Chassis and Kate Hancock to continue facilitating matters related to the Clean Development Mechanism registry referred to in paragraph 75B of the annex to the decision C/CMA 3. On the issue of agriculture, I have asked Milagros Sandoval and Monica Fiogge to continue facilitating the Coronavia joint work on agriculture. Regarding response measures, I have asked André Marceau and Daniel Watershoot to continue facilitating matters related to the Forum on the impact of the implementation of response measures serving the Convention, the KP, and PA. And finally, I have asked Hannah El-Hashmi to facilitate discussions on gender and climate change. I wish to extend my sincere appreciation and gratitude to all co-facilitators for their willingness to accept this important role. I strongly urge parties to use all available methods to make progress to complete the technical work by the end of Tuesday. Regarding presidency consultation, the meetings of heads of delegation will take place tomorrow to continue the discussions on the overarching decisions. Other presidency consultations are ongoing, and information on meetings and progress made can be found on the dedicated webpage on the UNFCCC website. As I mentioned earlier, I propose to invite pairs of ministers to lead informal consultations on outstanding issues that would benefit from political guidance starting from Wednesday. I will provide more information on this track of work soon. I have asked all facilitation teams to keep me informed on progress on a daily basis, including updates on text. My hope is that first drafts of text will start emerging this evening. To maintain a transparent and inclusive process and keep all parties informed, I will hold regular stock-taking meetings to report on the status of negotiations and progress achieved, as well as issues arising. Status updates, as well as the logistical arrangements for meetings, will be published on the UNFCCC website. I also wish to emphasize that the Presidency's door, my door, remains open to all parties. In order to ensure an orderly closure of the conference on Friday, 18th of November, I expect very few issues to remain open by the evening of Wednesday, 16th of November, when near final text will be presented. My priority for Thursday, 17th of November, will be to bring the work together and resolve outstanding issues, leaving time for document preparation. Our common objective is to adopt consensus decisions and conclusions on Friday that will constitute comprehensive, ambitious, and balanced outcomes of the Sharm el-Sheikh conference. I hope that this approach is agreeable to all of you. Distinguished colleagues, over the past year, and indeed in the course of the past 10 days, we have all heard strong messages from science and from people at the front lines, reminding us of the gravity of the situation, the cost of inaction, and of the need for urgent, impactful progress at these negotiations. We have also heard strong messages calling for ambition in the outcomes that translate to delivery in implementation at scale and at speed. Heads of state and government also showed commitment and political will to change course and show more ambition. It is now up to us all here to rise to the occasion and respond to the demands and calls from our communities around the world who will accept no less than meaningful outcomes at COP27. Time is not on our side, and the world is watching. Let us come together and deliver now. Distinguished colleagues, we have now reached the end of our informal stock-taking plenary. Let us get down to work. I wish you all a productive day. Are there any delegations which would like to take the floor at this time? I see none. I would therefore wish you all a very productive day, and this meeting is now adjourned. Thank you very much.
forests and prairies that used to be on that land is very substantial. So this is a map in the US, and it shows how many tons of carbon could be captured per hectare of land on land that's currently being used for animal agriculture. And as you can see, it ranges from a few hundred to several hundred tons can be captured on every hectare. And when you think about the projected carbon prices, the World Bank projects they'll be $50 to $100 by 2030. Let's see if that happens. I hope so. That translates into thousands or tens of thousands of dollars that they can earn per hectare over the next several decades, which is orders of magnitude more money than they're making currently. So the farmers can save us from climate change by changing what they do, and it's a win-win for farmers and the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat. Thank you. I will afterwards open the floor for a Q&A, but I will now let the floor to Didier Toubia, the co-founder and CEO of Aleph Farms, that we've also seen quite a lot around the COP, around the pavilion, very active also on the climate change discussions. So thank you so much, Didier, for being with us. And I will let you for 4 or 5 minutes before opening the floor for Q&A.
Thank you, Raphael and GFI. We should switch to our slides, maybe? Next one? Okay. Thanks, and thanks, Pat, for emphasizing the importance of farmers and agriculture in reverting climate change. The good news is that there are new technologies which can make up for higher quality but lower quantities of beef production. As you know, beef production is one of the most impactful protein production out there on Earth today. According to the FAO, the cattle industry is responsible for close to 8% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And animal farming is using most of the fresh waters used in agriculture, as well as the largest part of the land which is used for food production. One of the new technologies which is currently under development and which is coming to market in the next year and couple of years is cultivated meat. Aleph Farms is one of the pioneers in this space, and cultivating meat is about building the meat from the ground up, from the same building blocks which make the meat we know today. And meat is primarily a muscle tissue, like any other tissue or any other organism. Is made of cells, the tiniest living entity in our bodies. And we're able to isolate cells which divide and interact to make a muscle tissue in nature. And we can transfer those cells into a controlled environment, what we call a bioreactor, which replicates the same conditions as inside the animal, so that the cells continue to grow, to interact, and to form a tissue under a controlled environment. We then seed those cells onto a scaffold, which is a matrix, which is inducing the formation of a structure which replicates a very similar texture as the muscle tissue which grows inside the animal in 4 weeks, instead of 1.5 to 2 years, up to 3, 4, and maybe more years in certain countries for waiting for a spontaneous formation of muscle tissue and then harvesting it from the carcass of a slaughtered animal. We do believe that plant-based can be a great solution for addressing meat consumption on the short and mid-term. In our views, cultivated meat will have the greatest impact on the mid and long term. And why is it important? Because the meat sector is responsible as a single industry for most methane emissions in the world. And I'd like to emphasize for a minute the importance of methane. As compared to CO2, methane has a warming potential which is up to 80 times more than CO2. On the other hand, while CO2 stays in the atmosphere forever, for 800 years, methane breaks down within 12 to 14 years. Meaning that if we can reduce the amount of methane we emit versus reducing the amount of CO2, we can amplify the impact of reduced emissions. For any ton of methane we reduce, we reach the same warming impact or dewarming, cooling impact as reducing 80 tons of CO2. But on top of that, because methane gets away from the atmosphere, breaks down within a bit more than a decade, we can also reduce at midterm the amount of greenhouse gases which are stored in the atmosphere, while reducing the amount of CO2 we emit is piling up slowly CO2 in the atmosphere and it stays there forever. It's not reducing the amount of CO2 which is captured in the atmosphere. So in our analogy, we would refer to, let's say, driving on a highway. Reducing CO2 emission is like driving slowly in the wrong direction. We're inducing slower pace of climate change, while reducing methane is changing direction and driving in the right direction, meaning tackling climate change issue and reverting climate change, meaning being net negative instead of waiting for hundreds of years to see any effect. So this is the importance of tackling cattle and the meat industry, and the role of governments here will be very important. We'd like to call for two directions in policy making. The first one is to make sure that we support the right practices. Both in conventional farming, we need to support farmers to revert to more regenerative agricultural practices, including with animal farming. And second, we need to make sure that those new approaches for producing animal products and animal proteins are not penalized by negative incentives. So we need system-based, holistically, the meat sector and animal protein sector, and make sure that we align the incentives with our goals in terms of climate change and social and nutrition and health impact. The second direction, which is in our view key in policy making, is to have direct support to help those new technologies bridging the first years when they scale up. Cultivated meat, for instance, which is one of the technologies we believe has the most potential, and the elephant is one of those players, will require a few years to scale up and to get to price parity. Same as renewable energy, like solar panels or electric vehicles, which are originally more expensive, and their cost is going down as we improve the production processes, improve the technologies, and leverage economies of scale. Cultivated meat will need to get support, tax breaks, or off-take agreements, debt guarantees, in order to bridge the first years of scaling up so that it can get to mainstream and drive the impact we're targeting. So in a summary, we believe that the meat industry is on one hand a great challenge, but there are also huge opportunities to address climate change, working hand in hand with the different stakeholders in the meat ecosystem to achieve a reversion, to revert climate change. And for that, we need both innovators and new technologies, but also to work hand in hand with the public sector, and we need to foster this public-private partnership for the purpose of improving the condition of all the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Didier. Thank you very much. We'll have time for one question, if there is, and if not, we will be also available at the exit right after the press conference. Is there a question? Yes.
I just wanted to ask, so my name's Isha and I'm from India, and dairy and meat is something that supports a lot of livelihoods, and transforming an economic system back home in India is a big task. So how do you start? Where do you start? And how do you start selling this idea to the government? Because it's sort of rooted in our culture to eat dairy and meat and all of that. So how do you promote this idea to people that run their livelihoods based off of these farms and ranches?
Thank you. Who would like to answer? I would limit to 30
I'll
seconds,
give a
1
quick
minute.
answer. Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think the thing is that they're at if the world values and recognize the value of addressing and reversing global heating economically, then there's a huge economic incentive for people who are currently raising animals for food to stop, basically, and focus on restoring the ecosystems that have been essentially destroyed by converting them to cattle grazing, and make a living doing that. That's much more, those farmers are not making a lot of money, okay? And the value that a lot of people project the world will place on capturing a ton of carbon is much greater, offers a much greater potential livelihood. It's not simple to turn that into reality, but I would say the market forces are all there leading to it.
Thank you. Ala?
I would just like to add that though definitely dairy products and animal proteins are part of the culture worldwide, we do believe and we do see by history that if we are able to provide products that taste the same or better and cost the same or less without the environmental consequences, the consumer will go towards that trend as well.
Didier?
I just want to talk about the consumer aspect, the acceptance angle. There is a preconceived idea that the food habits and food culture are very rigid and don't change over time. That it's difficult to change them. It's untrue. It's completely wrong. History teaches that the food habits in most of the countries are changing very quickly. Half of the food we're eating today did not exist 50 years ago, and maybe 90% of the food we're eating today did not exist 100 years ago. If we're talking about the US as a very large market, the sushi started 30 years ago. The tacos is completely new. The milkshake started in mid-century. The hamburger, which is today 70% of the beef consumption in the US, started 100 years ago. It's nothing in the history of meat consumption. So we do see that practically the facts show that we change our habits relatively quickly. We just need the products to be great and the consumers to have this incentive to switch.
Thank you so much. We'll have to leave it for the next panel, and we'll see you outside if you want to chat more. Thank you.
C'était, mesdames et messieurs, une des séances de la COP27, conférence du climat, qui se tient à Sharm el-Sheikh. C'était une séance consacrée au carbone et au méthane, et bien sûr à la réduction du gaz, qui était transmise en direct sur Nile TV International, qui a transmis plus tôt une autre séance du chef de la diplomatie, Samer Choukri, qui a été consacrée à l'adaptation et les genres de sexe et également sur l'agriculture. Une page sur website sera disponible selon le chef de la diplomatie et président de la COP27, Samer Choukri, afin de fournir les détails et les progrès des sujets examinés. Et il sera toujours prêt pour des négociations avec toutes les parties afin de poursuivre les consultations sur la COP27. La gravité de la situation de l'environnement, je cite les paroles du chef de la diplomatie, a été clairement justifiée par les scientifiques durant les 10 derniers jours et nous, plutôt le monde entier, devra maintenant mettre en place les projets contre le changement climatique.
Because at the end of the day, doesn't matter who you worship, if you're doing so on a burning planet, you're kind of in trouble. So with that, I'll pass it back to David.
I'd like to call on Bishop Andrew Holmberg of the Stockholm Diocese of the Church of Sweden.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Yes, I totally agree with what you just said. I think we need to tap really deep into our own traditions. Climate change, the climate crisis, is not only a crisis of technology, economy, financing, and all these things, but I think it's first and foremost, it's a crisis also with spiritual and existential dimensions. And as faith leaders, we have centuries of experience of addressing those kinds of questions. What is a good life? What does it mean to be rich? So I think really a main contribution with peoples of faith towards this whole issue of climate crisis is asking the right questions. And like you just said, data sets, statistics, devastating scenarios don't seem to be able to change us. So we need to tap into our different perceptions and in our minds and hearts. And I think religious traditions are really well posed to do that, to change the minds of people. And Jesus speaks in the New Testament of the Bible of repentance, of metanoia. And metanoia, the literal translation of the Greek, is change your way of thinking. And I think that's where the faith traditions of all kinds need to contribute much more, to help people change their way of thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop. I'd like to call on Sister Maureen Goodman of Brahma Kumaris.
Thank you. As has been pointed out, the faith traditions are in a unique situation to help change hearts and minds, because this is very much what is needed to avert a climate catastrophe. I quote from a French astronaut who saw the Earth from space, and he said, "The Earth doesn't need to be saved, she just needs to be loved." And this speaks of our relationship with the Earth. One is a relationship of dominance and exploitation and separation. The other is a relationship of symbiosis, a relationship of respect, a relationship where both the Earth and humanity can flourish. This is the relationship that we have to now put back into perspective. We are all part of God's creation, and God has given us many, many gifts. The gift of peace, the gift of love and compassion, and the gift of wisdom. And it's in our reflection and prayer and meditation that we can access the inner wisdom that is going to be able to provide the solutions for our planet. A change of consciousness, a change of mindset is definitely needed, and it has to come from all of us. Thank you. And I'm very pleased that the Elijah Interfaith Institute brought together the religious leaders for these 10 principles for changing and our way of thinking, our perspective, and our relationship with the earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister. I would like to call on Rabbi Yonatan Nerel of the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development in Jerusalem.
The ecological crisis is a spiritual crisis. It's a crisis of how we live as spiritual beings in a physical reality. And the question is, when will religion, the sleeping giant, wake up to address the ecological crisis? Over the past number of months, we've worked to promote 10 universal principles for climate justice, which were formulated by the Elijah Board of World Religious Leaders and released a couple days ago at a climate repentance ceremony in London. And another group was at Mount Sinai with these tablets. Some people think that perhaps it's a little sacrilegious to talk about 10 universal principles for climate justice. But I think it's sacrilegious to degrade God's creation. God wants us to take care of it, and we are releasing these 10 universal principles, not because we think that we're God, but because we realize that humanity needs to do a better job of living in balance on God's creation. My hope and my prayer is that the next generation will inherit a livable, thriving, and sustainable planet, and that the religions will help humanity to raise their level of soul awareness so that we can take responsibility, live with humility, moderate our consumption, and think long-term for ours and future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'd like to call upon Bishop Mark Andrews of the Episcopal Church.
Thank you, David. I serve as the delegation head for the Episcopal Church, which is the United States and 17 other member nations of the United Nations, but I particularly live and serve in the San Francisco Bay Area. And when I read these 10 principles, I believed that they are universal and that as such they are pointing to a reality that is beyond them. In other words, these leaders who
the correct political messages that are urgently needed to shape our work in this critical decade. Finally, I would like to assure you that we will spare no effort to come to an outcome from this COP which is balanced and satisfactory to all, and which is able to move forward the efforts on mitigation and the overall climate agenda. We plan to issue an informal note under the Presidency's authority, which will reflect different views expressed during this high-level ministerial roundtable. I thank you and welcome you all again. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your inspiring words, Your Excellency. Now it gives me great pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Simon Steele, Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, for his keynote address. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, James. Mr. President, distinguished ministers, colleagues, delegates, dear friends, welcome to the first high-level ministerial roundtable on pre-2030 ambition. We're convened here today to look down the barrel of a gun pointed directly at us. We're coming together here to discuss our collective fate. The NDC synthesis report of last month concluded that current commitments will increase emissions by 10.6% by 2030, on track for a rise in temperatures of around 2.5 degrees Celsius. UNEP's emissions gap report warned that unconditional NDCs give us a 66% chance of limiting global warming to about 2.6 degrees by the end of the century. The world is bending the curve on emissions downwards, but neither of the statistics I gave tell us that we are anywhere close to limiting rise to 1.5 degrees. The latest IPCC report says that we had to peak emissions before 2025. That's peaking in just 2 years' time. If that is to happen, we have to send a clear signal from COP27 to policymakers, markets, and individuals that this is happening. Part of that signal is an ambitious and impactful mitigation work program launched here today with 3 key components. The first, a strong commitment to bring down emissions at a much faster rate. Greater momentum towards more impactful actions, and clear assurances from key parties that they will urgently take concrete actions to raise ambition and keep us on a path towards 1.5 degrees. As things stand, this is the only way to demonstrate that the multilateral process can address the urgency and scale of the climate crisis. The only way we are going to mobilize everyone behind our collective endeavor. The conference decision on the mitigation work program must reflect the level of urgency, the gravity of the threats we're facing, and the shortness of the time we have remaining to avoid the devastating consequences of runaway climate change. Our decision has to recognize and respond to the latest warnings of the science. It must establish a platform for parties to scale up mitigation ambition and implementation through concrete actions. And it must set up the collaborative environment necessary to collectively close the emissions gap by the end of this decade. To get us on track for 1.5, the mitigation work programme should include yearly decisions that can inform actions and indicate to the world how the multilateral process is responding to the urgency indicated by the science. Concrete actions, tangible solutions that go beyond commitments and demonstrate implementation and support. And results that are genuinely transformational and can be scaled up and replicated. As custodian of this process, I'm only asking for what is in the Paris Agreement, whose content are universally supported by all parties. This is clearly achievable and absolutely necessary. The discussions and outcomes of this roundtable will send a powerful political signal both inside and outside the UNFCCC process. It will drive and multiply climate ambition and implementation. So let's collectively disarm the threats, the very real threats that we face. I thank you.
Thank you, Executive Secretary. With this, we conclude our opening session. Now, to set the scene for our discussion today, we will now hear from Bernd Hackman of the UNFCCC Mitigation Division, who will present the key outcomes from the NDC and long-term low-emission development strategies synthesis reports. Mr. Hackman, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, James. May I ask for the slides, please? Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you very much. As the COP president and also the executive secretary have already mentioned, the Secretariat published an NDC synthesis report. In this report, we looked at the latest 166 NDCs that have been communicated to the Secretariat by all parties to the Paris Agreement. Amongst these NDCs, there were 142 new or updated NDCs representing 169 parties. Next slide, please. As you can see on this slide, the parties covered by the NDC synthesis report altogether, they account for 95% of global emissions, 98% of global GDP, and 98% of global population. One can really say that this synthesis report provides an overview of global climate action and synthesizes the global response to climate change. Next slide, please. Let me walk you through a couple of highlights that we saw when looking at all these NDCs. First of all, the quality of information that has been presented in these NDCs increased considerably compared to where we were prior to Paris with the INDCs, underpinning the strong commitments of parties in their pledges. It is clear from these NDCs and also increasingly clear from the long-term strategies that interlinkages and co-benefits of mitigation and adaptation are much better understood and are increasingly addressed together. NDCs are also much better aligned with broader development goals and priorities, with long-term strategies and also with the SDGs. It is clear from these NDCs that parties around the world are integrating their climate action into development planning aspects. What also becomes very clear is that non-party actors and other stakeholders are increasingly involved both in the planning process for climate action, but also, and that is even more important, in the implementation of these activities. We found that an underlying current to most of these NDCs is driven by just transitions. This is a main driver for implementation, and it signals once again the necessity for everyone to get on board and to stay on and not being left behind. Very briefly on adaptation, the NDCs clearly show that adaptation is moving towards more integrated national frameworks, with national adaptation plans being established as main instruments for national level planning. On mitigation, a key role is clearly with renewable energies. This is the most frequent mitigation option in the NDCs, followed by energy efficiency improvements in buildings and in cities in general, and multi-sectoral energy efficiency improvements. Next slide, please. And now let me show in a more visual way maybe also what the Executive Secretary was referring to. We also estimated the aggregate effect of NDCs in this report. What you see in red here, this is what we estimate where the NDCs lead us in terms of GHG emissions by 2030. By 2030, global GHG emissions are estimated to be around 52.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. This is still 10% higher, 10.6% higher than in 2010, but 0.3% lower than in 2019, indicating, as was referred to by the Executive Secretary, that emissions are plateauing and are also slightly decreasing by 2030. So a peak may have been reached. What we also see, and that is the gray shade above the red one, that we are much better than in the INDCs. The Paris Agreement mechanism of improving over time is working, but it is slowly working. What we also see in this slide is that when we compare these emission projections to what the IPCC tells us, we are far from where we need to be. What you see in blue is what the IPCC estimates for global emissions to the global trajectory for emissions to reach 2 degrees. And below there, in green, you see what the IPCC estimates for global emissions to look like for reaching 1.5 degrees. It is clear from this assessment that we have a broad emissions gap in front of us that needs to be closed. And it's also clear that if implementation is not addressed immediately and started immediately, we are not only facing this ambition gap you see in this slide, but also an implementation gap staying behind the NDCs themselves. With this, I would like to close this presentation, and I'm looking forward to the presentation by the IPCC following up on this one, and hand over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Hackman. I would now like to invite Professor Jim Skea, co-chair of Working Group 3 of the IPCC, for his presentation on mitigation options and the contribution of Working Group 3 to the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. Professor, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates. Our UNFCCC colleagues have clearly demonstrated the two gaps that need to be closed to move us onto an emissions trajectory consistent with the long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. There is an emissions gap and there is an implementation gap. And today I would like to focus on evidence from this year's IPCC Working Group 3 report concerning how these gaps can be closed, and importantly, the means that we have to close these gaps. Next slide, please. evidence about the gaps. The word gap itself is actually quite disheartening. And what I'm going to try to do in this presentation is to inject a sense of hope and agency by showing, firstly, that there are options available which can be deployed almost immediately to start closing the gap by 2030. And secondly, that it's within the power of policymakers, if they choose to use that power, to put in place the enabling conditions, the institutions, policies, finance, technology and human capacity for these options to be taken up. As well as the long-term emission scenarios chapter in the IPCC report, there are 7 sectoral chapters that set out what can be done now, and 4 chapters on establishing enabling conditions. So I'm going to briefly address 3 questions: what can be done, why it should be done, and how it can be made to happen. Next slide, please. So first the what and the options themselves. There are many options available now in all sectors that could halve global greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 compared to 2019 levels at costs of less than $100 per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. And more than half of that potential comes in at less than $20 per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent, with some measures actually paying for themselves. The largest contributions to the potential lie in energy and agriculture, forestry and land use. And just to compare, CO2 prices in compliance-driven emissions trading schemes currently range between $8 and $80 per tonne, and in voluntary markets between $2 and $6 per tonne. Next slide, please. Within energy, by far the largest potential of around 8 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent lies with renewable energy, particularly wind and solar, where costs have fallen dramatically in recent years. A substantial part of that renewable potential can be achieved at a negative cost, as long as the enabling conditions in place. There's a further significant potential from reducing fugitive methane emissions from fossil fuel systems, a neglected opportunity until recently. And other context-specific opportunities with a smaller potential in the short term include more established renewable technologies, nuclear for those countries which choose to use it, and carbon capture and storage. Next slide, please. Agriculture, forestry and land use also has a similarly large short-term potential, though at a generally higher cost than energy sector measures. The biggest opportunities are in reduced conversion of forests and other ecosystems, ecosystem restoration, afforestation and reforestation, and carbon sequestration in agriculture, for example through soil management. And within the food system, reducing waste and dietary shifts could also play a role, though the costs cannot be characterised. Next slide, please. In the short term, there are also opportunities across the demand sectors: buildings, transport and industry. For buildings, and even more so for transport, options are available at a negative cost. Enhanced efficiency in switching to alternative energy carriers, notably electricity, are the key measures. The industrial potential comes at a higher cost, and in the short term it's dominated by energy efficiency, materials efficiency through circular economy approaches, and fuel switching. We should not forget that more ambitious emission reductions will be needed beyond 2030 to meet the long-term temperature goal. The pre-2030 period is also time to prepare for measures required in the longer term through technological innovation, as existing capital stocks of equipment that supply and use energy, like power stations, vehicle, space heating and cooling equipment, come to be replaced. Slide 7, please. Next slide. Now, why should we pursue these options? Apart from the obvious avoidance of climate impacts and risks, one reason is that for a given temperature goal, it will be cheaper in the long term to take action now. Action now will reduce the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and avoid the need for very rapid reductions of emissions later on. If we carry on with current NDCs and still aspire to limit warming to 2 degrees with a 67% likelihood, emissions, as shown in the purple band there, would need to fall twice as fast in the 2030s and 2040s than they otherwise would if we had acted immediately. This poses challenges in terms of costs, stranded assets, raising finance, and following just transition principles. Next slide, please. A second reason is that action now brings multiple co-benefits. The Working Group 3 report identifies multiple synergies between mitigation actions and the sustainable goals, and I promise not to go in detail through this slide. But these links are varied and they depend on local circumstances. But to mention a few, air quality and the consequent health benefits from electrification of transport, more affordable energy by investing in energy efficiency, energy security, decent jobs and sustainable growth from the expansion of new industries, more sustainable cities and communities, and more sustainable agriculture and land use through better management of agricultural activities and soils. So this brings me to the last question, and the evidence from the latest report is that we do know how to do this. It's as if we've laid out all our tools on the workbench, but have yet to pick them up and start working evidence. But the evidence we have is that policies work. And of course, the realisation of co-benefits and the avoidance of trade-offs also depends on the way in which actions are promoted, incentivised and implemented. Next slide, please. Policies already in place have delivered quantifiable emission reductions of several gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. They've resulted in sustained emissions reductions in some countries and, as has been said already, have bent the curve globally, even if we've yet to see an emissions peak. Direct climate legislation covers more than half of global emissions, and more than 20% of global emissions are covered by some form of carbon pricing, though at levels that are certainly insufficient at the moment to get us towards the long-term temperature goal. Carbon pricing has a role to play in sectors such as power generation industry, but there is a much wider policy tool set available. In demand-side sectors such as buildings and transport, where there are millions, if not billions, of different actors, markets are less efficient and different instruments, regulations, standards, sunset requirements on obsolete technologies, information, advice and education, and supply-side interventions addressing skills, training and supply chains will be needed, as well as financial incentives. These kinds of considerations will also apply to agriculture and land use, given the predominance of smallholders in many parts of the world. And finally, to say this will not happen without adequate financial flows. Investment gaps for mitigation are lower than those for adaptation, but they're still large, especially in developing countries. And measures cannot be implemented unless the human capacity and the technology is in place to carry them through. Last slide, please. So just to end, science, as assessed by IPCC, has provided clear evidence on what can be done, why it should be done, and how it can be made to happen. Scientists stand ready to assist with implementation and have been active in the technical dialogue of the global stocktake which took place last week. But now it's over to leaders and decision makers. What will you do to act on the evidence that science has provided? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Esquella. I would now like to invite Ms. Hong Tu Patterson, Chief Financial Officer and Chief Operating Officer at the Green Climate Fund, for her presentation on best practices and success stories related to transformational mitigation action and associated partnerships cooperation. Ms. Patterson, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, thank you for inviting the Green Climate Fund to this important event showcasing one of the fund's innovative projects and programs creating transformational mitigation impact on the ground. In order to meet net zero emissions by 2050, this would require unprecedented changes in energy production and use, which accounts for around 2/3 of GHG emissions. To limit global temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius, the share of renewable energy systems in the global supply mix must also advance to reach between 75% and 80% of global electricity demands by 2050. Approximately 840 million people need to be provided with clean energy access by 2030, according to SDG 7. Against this backdrop, I would like to present to you SRMI, our Sustainable Renewables Risk Mitigation Initiative facility, as one example that showcases GCF's unique role in addressing key risks to support energy transition and reaching NDC goals of countries in need. So first of all, please allow me to offer you a snapshot of the environment as well as the country NDC vision under which this funding proposal is operating. The SRMI facility aims to deliver tailored support to 7 target countries across Asia and Africa, namely Botswana, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kenya, Namibia, Uzbekistan, and Mali. According to the latest, if you can go back, please. According to the latest available data, these countries represented 1.2% of the total global GHG emissions. Under a BAU scenario, they would triple their emissions on average between 2017 and 2030. All of these countries already announced strong commitment to reducing their GHG emissions, some aiming to reduce as high as 89% against BAU scenario. In terms of NDC targets, the question of how the economic recovery is designed remains crucial in shaping the long-term pathways for emissions and determining whether the NDC targets can be achieved. In addition, the energy sector represents, in most of these countries, the main contributor of emissions, representing almost 85% of GHG emissions in Uzbekistan, 68% in Botswana, and in Mali, 31%. To reach their NDC targets, the 7 countries will need to transform their energy sector. Next slide, please. We believe providing universal access to electricity will be central to achieving these countries' climate goals, particularly in the context of rapidly increasing the share of variable renewable energy used in energy generation. The falling technology costs make investment in renewable energy commercially viable in more and more countries. Nonetheless, global investment remains below the targets needed to meet the Paris Agreement's objectives and its potential. A range of constraints can obstruct private sector financing into renewable energy projects, many of which are closely related to the national environments, such as the limited generation of transmission planning capacity of utilities, lack of adequate public and private partnerships or IPPs, independent power producers, regulatory framework, weak competitive procurement capacity to select more expensive tariffs, to select the independent power producers that has often led to purchase power agreements with more expensive tariffs than if reached under structured competitive bidding, limited financial viabilities of off-takers, and grid integration challenges. The SRMI is an innovative framework to help governments realize their NDC targets through removing the hurdles of energy transition by addressing the challenges they face in the development of renewable energies, supporting them to design and execute their post-COVID-19 recovery in a way that produces long-term pathways of low emissions while achieving energy access. In 2021, the GCF board approved SRMI Phase 1 for $280 million of grants and highly concessional loans and risk mitigation instruments, blended with $1.3 billion in IDA IBRD financing. Next slide, please. SRMI catalyzes climate financing through its 3 core windows. Technical assistance to help countries develop evidence-based variable renewable energy targets, implement a sustainable renewable energy program, and maintain robust procurement processes with transaction advisors. Critical public investments to enable the integration of variable renewable energy, finance solar, wind, park infrastructure, and increase access to electricity. And then thirdly, mitigate risk mitigation instruments to cover residual risks perceived by private investors. The program is expected to contribute to the shift to low-emission sustainable development pathways as follows. Firstly, to directly support the development of an estimated 2.4 gigawatts of renewable energy. And even after the end of project, it would also enable the integration of another 1.9 gigawatts of renewable energy. Directly reduce greenhouse gas emissions by nearly 98 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. Unlock an estimated 3.3 billion of private investments. Provide access to clean, low-emission electricity for an estimated 4.2 million people through the electrification investments. Strengthen institutional and regulatory systems for planning and development. And finally, locking in long-lived, climate-vulnerable infrastructure by increasing resilience of grid infrastructure. Next slide, please. SRMI proposes a streamlined process in a one-stop-shop approach from technical assistance to financing the critical public investments and the risk mitigation coverage needed to enable private investments at scale. This integrated approach can make a difference, particularly when countries are reprioritizing the scarce resources that are available for emergency responses, such as from COVID-19. SRMI aims at supporting countries transforming their strategy from low emissions development or to low emissions development, allowing them to harness their domestic resources at scale. GCF funding is critical to addressing the current renewable energy market failures identified and to ensure that countries continue their low carbon development pathway. The 7 countries are representative of different types of markets and energy sectors. So you can see the diversity in these countries with varying levels of electrification rates, low to high costs of generation, small to large grids, and so on and so forth. The success and lessons learned from these 7 countries will enable replication of the SRMI approach across countries and facilitate unlocking sustainable renewable energy markets for private investments. Next slide, please. In terms of the status of the implementation of this funding proposal, this program was approved by the board in March 2021. The FAA execution was also at the board approval and became effective only 1 month later. And the disbursements that was made to Uzbekistan in April after its finalization of the subsidiary agreement with the government. So you can see the speed at which the GCF has been moving. 2 projects were approved by the World Bank in March and June this year, and pending subsidiary agreement finalization, following which the disbursements will be made. And the World Bank Board will also be approving another 4 countries in 2023. So thank you so much for allowing us to share this project with you. I hope that it addresses the Executive Secretary's request for very tactical, tangible activities. And I would like to allow the Mali delegate, Dr. Alassani, to share Mali's experience in developing this funding proposal.
Thank you, Ms. Patterson. And as you just heard, we would like to give the floor to the delegate, Dr. Abba, Director General of the Agency for Environment and Development of Mali, for some remarks on experience with the GCF. The floor is yours, Dr. Abba.
Okay. Et bonjour à toutes et à tous. Le Mali est très heureux de prendre part effectivement à cet espace d'échange. Et je profite quand même pour remercier très sincèrement le Fonds vert climat qui, malgré la complexité d'accéder au fonds, nous avons eu effectivement le privilège de bénéficier d'un projet d'envergure pour participer à la réduction collective et mondiale. Bien vrai que le Mali est un pays de carbone, avec une émission de 0,003%, qui ne nous empêche pas effectivement de contribuer effectivement à cette approche. Il y a 4 grands secteurs qui sont prévus pour le Mali. le niveau des ambitions de réduction des gaz du scénario d'atténuation par rapport au scénario de base en 2030 est de 31% pour le secteur énergie, 25% pour le secteur agriculture, 39% pour le secteur forêt et changement d'affectation des terres et enfin 31% pour le secteur déchets. Et pour revenir effectivement au projet que nous avons eu le privilège d'avoir avec les fonds verts, c'est le projet d'électrification rurale de 50 localités dans 4 grandes régions du Mali. Kay, Koulikoro, Sikasso et Ségou par des systèmes solaires photovoltaïques au Mali. Et donc, ils sont effectivement des actions aussi de développement. Au-delà de l'aspect atténuation de réduction de gaz à effet de serre, c'est aussi une action de développement. Ce projet a pour objectif global de promouvoir au Mali l'électrification rurale par des systèmes solaires photovoltaïques isolés en tant que solution à faible intensité de carbone et de résilience face aux effets des changements climatiques dans le secteur de l'énergie au Mali. Et les objectifs spécifiques, c'est surtout de renforcer les capacités des institutions publiques et du secteur privé engagés dans l'électrification rurale pour l'accélération de l'électrification à base d'énergie solaire et sa mise à l'échelle dans les pays et dans la sous-région ouest africaine. Accroître le taux d'accès à l'électricité des populations rurales de 50 communes à partir des centrales solaires PV isolées et soutenir le marché de l'électrification rurale à base du solaire en favorisant l'accès des usagers productifs de l'énergie aux services financiers. La puissance totale à installer est de 3610 kW pour une énergie attendue de 10 541 200 kW par an. Et la réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre est estimée à 41 049 tonnes CO2 par an et 821 782 après 25 ans. Et voyez-vous l'importance effectivement de ce projet pour notre pays, le Mali. On profite ici de cet espace uniquement pour demander au Fonds vert climat de pouvoir nous faciliter l'accréditation quand même de nos entités pour nous permettre de mieux soulever les fonds et s'attaquer effectivement à ces grands secteurs qui nous concernent, qui sont des actions de réduction en même temps d'adaptation. L'agriculture, les déchets, la foresterie et l'énergie. C'était un pas à remercier. Nous sommes dans le domaine de l'énergie, mais nous demandons aussi effectivement à tous ces acteurs présents ici, surtout les pays développés qui sont effectivement indexés, de pouvoir appuyer cet appui ici. Nous vous remercions quand même de cette écoute et je suis très bref et c'est pour remercier une fois de plus le Fonds vert climat. Et je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Merci, Dr. Ba, d'avoir partagé votre expérience avec le GCF. And many thanks to all the presenters for important scene setting and insights today. We will now move to the roundtable discussion, and it is my pleasure to introduce the ministerial co-facilitators who will moderate the discussion today. Her Excellency, Ms. Barbara Creasy, Minister of Forestry, Fisheries, and Environmental Affairs from the
So it's really hard to say which country shares the most responsibility. When you look at, for example, greenhouse gas emissions from consumption patterns, there are definitely some countries, mainly G20 countries, that have significantly higher greenhouse gas emissions than others. And when we're talking about things like dietary shifts and these very specific actions that should be taken in different places, it doesn't look the same in all countries, so some countries are going to have to shift their diets a lot more dramatically than others. There are a lot of countries around the world that are still facing significant burdens of undernutrition, and greenhouse gas emissions might have to increase from the food systems in those particular countries, and that's something that we're going to have to deal with. It is this giant global jigsaw puzzle in terms of really trying to figure out what's happening in what country, and having a better understanding of that moving forward is absolutely, very, very important.
Thank you, Brent. Dr. Eldada, would you like to comment on that? Yes, sure. It's clear that it's the responsibility of everyone. I mean, and as I said, food concerns
We
everyone.
need to put more content into the framework. We all have our part to play. This is a common responsibility. But it is also a differentiated responsibility. Developed countries and emerging economies have a special obligation to do more, to show the way. This COP cannot be the COP where we give up on the 1.5 target. On the contrary, this COP should show that we are still determined and that failure is not an option. We need to stand united in the fight against climate change. Today, we share our experiences and set the global direction on how we can collectively ramp up our ambition and accelerate action in this critical decade. And make no mistake, it is necessary. As His Excellency UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres pointed out last week, we are on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. So let's do something about it. Now, it gives me pleasure to hand over to my co-facilitator, Her Excellency Ms. Barbara Creasy, to provide the modalities for this roundtable. Please.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. As we have heard in the presentations that have been given to us this morning, the science is clear and the gap between what is happening and what we need to happen remains. We have also heard this morning that there are considerable opportunities that confront us in what we can do to reduce the gap. However, we are also aware that barriers remain. Our discussion this morning needs to focus on the opportunities. It needs to focus on overcoming the barriers. And it needs to give attention to a common theme that emerged in all of the NDCs that were submitted, namely the issue of how we promote just transitions that give opportunities to those who live under conditions of poverty and vulnerability, to shape the nature of transitions and to ensure that they are also co-beneficiaries of the opportunities that new forms of energy production and new forms of manufacturing and industrial production and agricultural production will offer. Of course, what we all understand is one of the significant barriers for developing country economies remains the issue of means of implementation. And if we are to achieve the ambition that science requires of us, we will need to put our collective wisdom together to understand how we will overcome the barrier that means of implementation continues to pose to us. Ladies and gentlemen, we have these questions: opportunities for increasing ambition, barriers to accelerated implementation, operationalization of Article 4 and paragraph 11 of the Paris Agreement, and whether operationalizing elements of Article 4, especially paragraph 5, could help us in increasing ambition, scaling up implementation of mitigation in the context of ensuring just transitions, and lastly, linkages to the work program for scaling up mitigation ambition and implementation. These are all the questions that confront us this morning. We're now going to open up for contributions from the floor, and we would humbly request that we are setting the timer for 3 minutes, and we will unfortunately need to remind you when your time has expired so that we can maximize participation of the many people who are in this room this morning. Allow me to hand back to my co-facilitator to take the first round of comments.
Thank you so much. And our first speaker representing the AOSIS is Antigua. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Excellencies. I have the honor to present before you the position on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States. I want to thank the presenters for clearly showing the state of the climate crisis. OASIS has long sounded the alarm, yet we still seem to be heading off the precipice at a speed that will result in unimaginable loss and damage for our countries. Major emitters, especially developed countries, have not even promised to do enough, showcased through the inadequate ambition in national climate plans. The Paris Agreement's ratchet mechanism is working, but just not enough. Under current policies, end-of-century warming is projected to reach 2.7 degrees Celsius. Do you understand what this means for my fellow islanders? Colleagues, to safeguard humanity, countries must peak emissions immediately and have them by 2030 to keep 1.5 with no overshoot within reach. Incremental change is no longer an option. We need broad-based, economy-wide transformations across all sectors. Last year, we acknowledged our lack of progress and established a work program to support closing the ambition and implementation gaps in this critical decade. Deep emission cuts are required. The science is clear. We cannot rob Peter to pay Paul. This reality, however, is scary. In the face of the energy crisis, we have seen an uptake in coal and natural gas being touted as a transitional fuel, right in the window of our 1.5 carbon budget. Make no mistake, this will result in stranded assets. Colleagues, we are currently robbing the future generations of their right to a safe world, to pay the fossil fuel industry trillions in profit. In this annual roundtable, ministers need to see a report of the mitigation work programs, technical discussions including key findings, recommendations and options, so we can consider them and take collective action to respond to the greatest challenge of our time. This includes SID-specific solutions, so we are not left behind in the transition to the renewable energy economy. We need support and should be treated as a low-hanging fruit. While the global energy system is broken, the renewable energy revolution has begun, and we need to double down on those investments. It is the only way to a sustainable future. It is truly our only lifeline. We are against the clock, but we have options, and we must have this decade to act. No longer we wait, the more loss and damage we will need to respond to. I thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I pass the floor to somebody who gave a very, very inspiring speech at COP26. Many people did, but I think many of us remember when Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans of the EU showed us a text message from his grandchild, reminding us why it is that we're all here trying to save the planet for future generations. So, Frans, not to put any pressure on you, but we hope you will deliver just as many good speeches this year. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dan. And yeah, well, he's 2.5 now and running around, so you know things move on. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. There's been this very strange narrative going around that because of the challenges coming through to Europe because of Putin's war against Ukraine, we will be stepping back from our ambitions and stepping back from our programs. Nothing could be further from the truth, and I want to say this very clearly here today so that this misunderstanding might soon disappear. Not only do we stick to our commitments, we're even doubling down on them through Repower EU, but also through the legislations we are now deciding between the co-legislators in the EU, that's the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers. We took 3 decisions in the last couple of weeks on cars, on what every member state should do to share the effort, and on how we empower nature to be a better carbon sink. And they all lead to us being able to say that we're going to go even beyond the goal we have set of at least 55% emissions reductions by 2030. So there should be no misunderstanding. The EU is very much committed to this. And the EU is also very clear that if you want to be successful in this area, you have to not forget about the necessity of keeping up the levels of mitigation. 1.5 degrees should be kept alive, and I hope also this COP can agree on that, and that I'm really curious to hear from everyone what they are going to do in their countries to make that happen, to stick to the plans, etc., etc. We're in any case going to increase our efforts to reduce energy consumption, because I think this is an essential element, and also to speed up our transition to renewable energy. And just to be very clear, if this means in a short run we use more coal than we had anticipated, because we are going to go much faster with our energy transition, at the end of the day this does not lead to a bigger carbon footprint of the European Union. I know that we are, with the member states, the largest contributor to international public climate finance, but we also all know that what's on the table now is by far not enough to make the transition happen and to address the issue of adaptation and loss and damage. So we need to go from billions to trillions. This is never going to happen just with public money. We have to make sure we create the right conditions for the international financial system to be more in line with the necessity of the world community, but also to make it easier for investors to step in and to step in massively. So we need to also, and this, let me end on what is for me the most important point. We need to make sure that nobody is left behind. And I mean this within societies, but I also mean this in the global community. So the distress calls coming from countries that are faced with these huge climate emergencies, these huge effects of erratic weather patterns, they should be answered with concrete measures, concrete steps in the right direction. The EU and its member states stand ready to do that this week. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President Timmermans. I'm now inviting Bangladesh on behalf of the LDCs, and after that we will take Gabon and Japan.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. In terms of context, and I'm happy to present the LDC position today, in terms of context, let us be very clear on something. From the 2 reports that we have heard this morning, 1.5 degrees Celsius is possible. It is possible. It is doable. I think that's an important message. Secondly, for that to happen, emissions must peak before 2025. And they must be reduced by 43% by 2030 relative to 2019. And finally, we reach net zero in 2050. We have also heard 3 of the most important questions answered. What needs to be done, why we need to do it, and how it is to be done. So if the answers have been given, if the problem has been identified, if the pathway to a solution has been made crystal clear, why is there no action? Mr. Moderator, you mentioned that we need to put more content into the framework. And I think the content is political will. The content is leadership. The science is clear. In fact, UNFCCC, the agreement that we signed 30 years back, urged us to act even when the science was not conclusive. And today it is as conclusive as it can be. So there is absolutely no reason not to be able to act. And we know that the life support system that we are on is struggling to cope with a 1.1 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. It is going to stop functioning if we breach 1.5. So I think 1.5 is a red line, not just for the LDCs, but for the planet. So we simply cannot compromise on that. If we do, then we will all have to ask ourselves, what is it that we are doing here today talking about this issue? So that, I think, is very, very important for context. Even though the LDCs make a nominal contribution to climate change, we are taking action on all fronts. We are presenting ambitious action plans to reduce our emissions and plans to adapt to the impacts of climate change. We have seen the droughts in East Africa to floods hitting countries like Madagascar and the rapid melting of glaciers in Nepal and Bhutan, not to mention what Pakistan continues to experience with the flooding. This is why we need a program to urgently scale up mitigation ambition and implementation in this absolutely critical decade. At Sharm el-Sheikh, we must adopt a robust work program with a very clear roadmap to close the 2030 ambition gap and keep the 1.5-degree warning limit within reach. We must start on this action program, work program, next year and review it on an annual basis. We must see all governments submitting new or updated NDCs and strengthened targets consistent with what we clearly agreed to do in Glasgow. So here I again emphasize the point that what we are asking for is not something new. It is something that we have all agreed upon. So it is not a new element. We are just asking countries to keep their commitments and their pledges and promises. But unfortunately, that has not been the case. The UNFCCC's NDC synthesis report has been very disappointing. You mentioned, I think the person presenting the report mentioned it was disheartening. It's actually heartbreaking, because when we are talking about our very existence and survival, we are not acting when we have agreed to act. And that emissions in 2030 are likely to be much higher when we need to cut them in half. The multi-year work program needs a concrete calendar to 2024 with very clearly spelled out milestones, with a particular focus on high-emitting sectors till 2030. It must further maintain complementarity and linkage back to this high-level ministerial roundtable.
Can you move towards conclusion?
Yes, I'll just finish up, Mr. Moderator. And we refer to Article 4.11 of the Paris Agreement, and that must be front and center and operationalized. We also have some other points in written submission form, which we would like to submit, and we would ask them to be included in the records. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much. I'm now giving the floor to Gabon.
Thank you, Chair. I would certainly agree with the previous speaker when he said that the synthesis report is disappointing or heartbreaking. We need more ambition for the world. Gabon's second NDC makes a commitment to remain carbon neutral forever, basically. The words were to 2050 and beyond. I don't think many countries can be more ambitious than that. We also make a conditional commitment to trying to increase our net carbon absorption over the coming decades. as one of a very small club of countries who are not taking any carbon space in the atmosphere. We're actually making room for all of the countries around this table who are emitters, net absorbing over 100 million tons of carbon dioxide every year. But is the support there? We've worked through a 4-year audit program for our RED Plus credits at the UNFCCC, a very intense evaluation and auditing process, and now we're being told we have to go to the voluntary markets to find financing. When we try to reduce the emissions that we're already compensating in Gabon, in our energy sector, we're told to go to commercial banks and take loans at commercial rates to fund our just energy transition. And so we tend to feel that many of the developing nations around this table are showing more leadership than the developed nations. And we really have to come together and fix this issue of ambition, fix that trajectory that we just saw in the graphs that were shown by IPCC. And so we call on all nations to raise the ambition, and we will continue to show leadership on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Gabon. Can we take Japan?
Thank you, co-facilitator. My name is Nishimura Akihiro, Environment Minister of Japan. Even in today's difficult circumstances, such as soaring energy prices, the agreement of all parties on climate actions is unwavering. Our immediate climate action is essential in this critical decade until 2030, which is a pathway to net zero by 2050. To keep a limit of 1.5 degrees temperature rise within reach, parties whose NDCs and LTS are not aligned with the 1.5 degree target, especially in major economies, are required to revisit and strengthen their reduction targets. Building on the cop26 decisions, let us adopt a new cover decision with higher mitigation outcomes and a mitigation work program to urgently scale up mitigation ambition and implementation in this critical decade. We are obligated to show the international community our determination by adopting a balanced covered decision with putting emphasis on the importance of mitigation. A worldwide PDCA cycle on mitigation will catalyze increase of ambition and scale up implementation. In this regard, mitigation work program should cover all GHGs and sectors in NDC and equip a system to visualize the progress of each country's ambition, sharing advanced decarbonization technologies and innovations will help to fill in the existing gap of ambition and implementation. Japan will promote global green transformation to transform the entire social system to clean energy and achieve both net zero and economic growth. I would like to emphasize the importance of Article 6 in relation to the mitigation work program in order to promote global emission reductions. One of the key factors is to mobilize private finance by developing high-integrity carbon markets swiftly, in line with Article 6. Article 6 is a very effective tool to promote global emission reductions, and it also contributes to the expansion of private finance to support capacity building. On November 16th, Japan will launch the Paris Agreement Article 6 implementation partnership. as a responsibility of all generations living today. Let us conclude COP27 successfully. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to somebody who's probably used the term keeping 1.5 alive more times than anybody else in this room. The president of COP26, Alok Sharma. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Minister Jorgensen, Minister Creasy. Delighted that the two of you are co-facilitating. We couldn't have more experienced ministers doing this. And can I just remind all of us, friends, that at COP26 we did resolve collectively to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And I've always said that what we agreed in Glasgow and Paris have to be the baseline of our ambition. We've got to stick to that commitment. We cannot allow any backsliding. Look, we're already at 1.1 degrees global warming. I don't have to remind all of you the impacts of that around the world. And even at 1.5 degrees, we are still going to have devastating outcomes for many millions. And as our friend from Bangladesh has reminded us, 1.5 needs to be a red line. And this cannot be the COP where we lose 1.5 degrees. So we've got to fight for this, and every fraction of a degree absolutely makes a difference. And it is a difference for very many millions, including in each of your countries, between a tolerable existence and an impossible future. Let me remind you, a year ago, what Mia Mottley said in Glasgow. She said 2 degrees would be a death sentence for very many nations around the world. Look, I believe we can keep 1.5 alive. We've got the business community on our side. You will all have seen on Saturday 200 businesses, international businesses, signing up to an open letter in defense of 1.5. We are seeing impressive sectoral impacts, renewables, zero-emission vehicles. You've heard that in the presentations this morning. Yes, there is serious work going on finance. As Frans reminded us, we need to see more in terms of NDB reform. We need to do more on the just energy transition partnerships. Yes, we need to do more on finance. But on the 1.5, we need to make sure that we reaffirm our commitment to that. We've got a G20 leaders meeting going on right now. They showed leadership last year. They need to show that again. And they need, coming out of that G20, to reaffirm their commitment to Paris and to Glasgow. So in terms of mitigation outcomes here, very quickly, there are 4 things that I think we need to have. One is for those countries that have not set out their revised NDCs to do so, aligning with 1.5. We've got 33 countries already done so, including the UK. Secondly, let's make clear our commitment to the science. No rowing back from the science. We heard from the scientists this morning. Thirdly, we need to step out further steps on phasing down coal and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. And fourthly, we need to agree the modalities for the mitigation work programme to shift the dial on implementation and ambition. The reality is, without progress on mitigation, we are going to go beyond our ability to adapt. And of course, I want to see progress made on loss and damage here, but unless we stick to the mitigation piece, all of that is going to be a lot more difficult. So friends, in conclusion, we will either leave Egypt having kept 1.5 alive, or this will be the COP where we lose 1.5. You need to work out how you want future generations to look upon this COP and each of us individually as countries. It's really up to us to decide. I hope we will decide to keep 1.5 alive. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very forceful intervention, Alok. And now I give the floor to Singapore.
Thank you, co-facilitators. Colleagues, we cannot afford to end COP27, an implementation COP, without a credible plan to show that we are working hard to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. I would like to make 3 suggestions on how to achieve that, and that's ambition, actions, and alternative pathways. First, we need to raise ambition. Singapore has raised our ambition to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. To date, only 32 parties, including Singapore, have submitted updated NDCs, and just 11 have submitted new or updated long-term low-emissions development strategies, LEDS, in response to the Glasgow Climate Pact. We should reiterate the request for parties that have not done so to revisit and strengthen their 2030 NDCs to align with the Paris temperature goal and to submit their LEDS. We should also make a call for parties to achieve the peaking of emissions as soon as possible and to announce when they expect to do so for parties that have not done so earlier. Second, actions. It is not sufficient for parties to just make pledges. These pledges will need to be backed by concrete policies and measures. We need to facilitate actions from all relevant actors. The mitigation work program must involve all relevant actors, notably the private sector, multilateral development banks, and international financial institutions, civil society, etc., in our efforts to accelerate the transition to a net zero world. Third, we need to develop alternative pathways. One key lesson we can all learn from the energy crisis is the need to manage the net zero transition well. This will entail, first, stepping up collaborations and investments in low LEDS and low emission solutions such as hydrogen and CCUS, and two, facilitating flow of renewable energy to accelerate renewable energy development and regional decarbonization, and three, strengthening the ecosystem and supply chains for these clean energy solutions. The mitigation work program must facilitate the necessary collaborations and actions from all relevant actors, notably the private sector and academia, to not only work on solutions, but to work with the private sector to pool demand and drive costs down to make these solutions commercially viable and scalable. Chair, let me conclude by stressing that the mitigation work program must not just be another talk shop. Frankly, I'm a little concerned that the proposed modalities under the mitigation work program are largely premised on convening a series of technical or policy workshops on topics to be decided annually. The mitigation work program must ultimately facilitate more ambition and action in key sectoral and thematic areas to keep the 1.5-degree goal within reach. The annual report or outputs of the mitigation work program need to be action-oriented. The program ought to identify some key findings and concrete policy recommendations of best practices for the consideration of all parties in a nationally determined manner. The annual report should be submitted in time for the annual ministerial roundtable so that we, as ministers, may review its key findings and give the necessary political guidance to the CMA. We see the technical work and the political process of the high-level ministerial roundtable and the CMA as working in a mutually reinforcing group to drive action and ambition. I hope the above suggestions will help advance our deliberations on this very important issue of mitigation ambition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are now going to take Tuvalu and then Italy.
Thank you, co-facilitator. The evidence and the science is very clear. There is a very high probability of us overshooting the 1.5 trajectory if we do not take urgent action now. Urgent action to accelerate ambition and urgent action to accelerate the transition towards greener energy and greener economy. Anything beyond 1.5 is already a death sentence to small island, low-lying atoll nations such as my country, Tuvalu. So it is Tuvalu's view that we cannot continue to watch and allow countries and industry to approve and finance new coal, oil, and gas projects, while the climate crisis is literally on the shores of Pacific nations like my own home country of Tuvalu. More fossil fuel extraction means more destruction destructive loss and damage experienced by island nations and other vulnerable communities around the world. So a COP that does not address fossil fuels directly will be a COP that is complicit in the devastation of my people. That is why Tuvalu issued a formal call at COP27 for nation states to join Tuvalu and Vanuatu in developing a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. The production gap report of UNEP confirms that continuing fossil fuel expansion with oil, gas and coal projects is inconsistent with the goal of 1.5 degree. We are on track today to produce 110 more oil, gas and coal than allowed by the 1.5 target. A new fossil fuel treaty based on the principles of justice and equity should complement the Paris Agreement and address not just limits on countries' greenhouse gas emissions, but also which countries may continue to produce fossil fuels and how much. 1.5 is not just a goal, but a human right that can only be addressed by transitioning quickly away from fossil fuels. New international law is needed to control the production of fossil fuels. Those with capacities should tackle these issues in line with their responsibilities. And Tuvalu would like to see in the cover decision for this COP recognition that decarbonization requires a sharp reduction in the production and consumption of fossil fuels. And we call on parties to end expansion of new fossil fuel production and accelerate efforts towards the equitable phase down of fossil fuel power and phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. I thank you.
Thank you very much for those strong messages. And now,
can we take Italy?
Grazie. Signor Presidente, colleghi, signore e signori. Solo lo scorso anno, alla luce di chiare evidenze scientifiche, abbiamo convenuto a Glasgow che occorre mettere in campo ogni sforzo possibile per mantenere il riscaldamento globale entro il limite di 1,5 gradi. Il rapporto di sintesi presentato dal segretariato ci indica che, malgrado gli ulteriori sforzi compiuti, il divario da colmare rimane troppo ampio. La nostra azione deve essere dunque da un lato certamente accelerata e rafforzata e dall'altro trasformata in impegni concreti. Occorre disegnare un futuro a base di emissioni di carbonio, implementando soluzioni e iniziative per rendere l'economia e la società più resilienti, sostenibili, inclusive ed eque. Gli effetti dei cambiamenti climatici si fanno già sentire in tutto il mondo. L'Italia sta attualmente vivendo uno dei periodi di siccità più gravi mai registrati negli ultimi 30 anni, con forti impatti sulla natura e sul settore agricolo. E per quanto potremo avere la capacità di adeguarci a questi fenomeni, che saranno sempre più ricorrenti, rimane un limite a quello a cui possiamo adattarci. Le azioni di mitigazione, dunque, sono e devono rimanere al centro della nostra azione. In tale contesto, la decisione presa a Glasgow di definire un ambizioso programma di lavoro sulla mitigazione rappresenta un risultato importante. Il programma è un elemento chiave della struttura di governance globale per colmare il divario tra le azioni messe in campo e il livello necessario di riduzione delle emissioni in questo decennio, che consenta di rimanere entro un livello di innalzamento della temperatura sostenibile. Abbiamo l'opportunità di tradurre in decisioni politiche le discussioni tecniche, le migliori pratiche e le storie di successo relative all'azione di mitigazione trasformativa. Il programma di lavoro e questa tavola rotonda dovrebbero essere interconnessi e rafforzarsi a vicenda, La tavola rotonda darà attenzione politica alla discussione tecnica, mentre il programma di lavoro rappresenta un'opportunità preziosa per fornire ulteriore chiarezza e guidare le attività future del processo. Grazie.
Thank you so much. And now, on behalf of the LMDC Venezuela.
Sorry, it's Bolivia.
Okay, small change. Bolivia.
Muchísimas gracias. A nombre de LMDC vamos a hacer conocer como Bolivia lo que se ha trabajado en cuanto a misiones para el 2030. Los desafíos de los países en desarrollo son aún más apremiantes, en particular en los tiempos actuales con múltiples crisis que enfrentamos, incluidos los desafíos económicos, el aumento de endeudamiento en muchos países de desarrollo, el aumento de costo de vida, la inflación, incluyendo los precios de alimentos y los productos básicos. Gran parte de los impactos de los que nos enfrentamos hoy en día se debe principalmente a las emisiones históricas y acumuladas en los países en desarrollo. Quienes han incumplido, particularmente en virtud a aquellos acuerdos anteriores, nos referimos a los países desarrollados, creando además la crisis climática, una injusticia climática cada vez más profunda, lo que debería ser el trasfondo de la discusión de la ambición anterior al 2030. La ambición para el 2030 está intrínsecamente ligada al cumplimiento de los compromisos sobre la ambición 2020 en el contexto de la equidad y la responsabilidad comunes, pero diferenciadas y capacidades respectivas. La ambición está relacionada con todos los frentes de la lucha contra la crisis climática, incluida la mitigación, la adaptación, las pérdidas y daños y los medios de implementación, en particular la provisión de financiación y la transferencia de tecnologías. Respecto a la ambición en la reducción de las emisiones, los objetivos de la mitigación de los países desarrollados no son lo suficientemente ambiciosos ni se implementan lo suficientemente. Por tanto, los países desarrollados han tomado metas inadecuadas y poco ambiciosas para lograr cero emisiones netas al 2050, mientras continúan emitiendo y consumiendo desproporcionadamente el presupuesto global del carbono. Los países desarrollados deberían de alcanzar el cero neto mucho más antes del 2050, por lo menos para el 2025 o máximo para el 2030. Los países en desarrollo, por otro lado, han asumido compromisos de mitigación ambiciosos y están tomando medidas proactivas adecuadas a sus circunstancias nacionales y a pesar de la falta de apoyo en medios de implementación por parte de los países desarrollados.
Greenhouse gas emissions, we are now using emission estimates from the year 2021. So the data includes the rebound after the COVID pandemic. Not yet 2022, but we are including 2021. And we are always looking at the current level of emissions or renewables or energy efficiency, but also the trend, whether the trend is in line with what's necessary for the Paris Agreement. If you click one further, then you can see on the greenhouse gas emissions side, we also look at targets, because this is one important thing of this conference, whether countries update their greenhouse gas mitigation targets, so that's something that flows into it. On the climate policy, and that is something very special of this index, we asked 450 experts around the world to rate the climate policy of the countries. That is unique, and there's no other project that is doing that. So one first remark on the results. We see that the energy crisis really is in the way of ambitious climate policy right now. We see that there's a huge dash for gas, that many countries are implementing new fossil fuel infrastructure, in particular gas. And if we are serious about the Paris Agreement, we do not need new gas infrastructure. And we also see that some countries that we list here, they don't have that need to build new gas because they have started very early on energy efficiency and renewables, and they are basically have a much better position now. But for the details, I hand over to Jan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Niklas, and I'm now happy to present you this year's results of the Climate Change Performance Index. You see here the map. If you check the map, you see which countries we cover. These countries, our 60 countries, or this year 59 countries, because we had to exclude Ukraine, are covering nearly 92% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So these are the countries that are really responsible for the problems we are facing. Next slide, please. So again, we check with our indicators whether one of the leading countries is on track to prevent dangerous climate change. Despite that we have leaders and they're doing better than the others, even the countries in the front like Denmark, Sweden, Chile, Morocco, India are doing not enough to prevent dangerous climate change, so we cannot put them on the podium this year. However, few sentences on Denmark, for example. Denmark is in these 3 out of 4 categories ranked high or very high. This is a good thing. However, experts criticize even Denmark about its high energy use and a lot of room for energy efficiency in Denmark still there. And the policies they have in the moment are not sufficient to reach their own set targets until 2025. If you look at the 3 countries, more the developing countries, which are on the front, Chile, Morocco, and India, they have in common that have relatively low emissions altogether, relatively lower per capita emissions. All are trying to extend the renewables very much. This is distinguishes these countries very much from the developing countries in the end. Like the 3 countries, Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, are really having no renewables in the moment. And so here we see a big change, a big difference regarding the solutions, regarding energy use and renewables, but also, of course, regarding the emissions. And now I want to emphasize a bit on the elections that we had in the last year, and put just some countries in the front. First of all, maybe Sweden was a long time, since I can think of, it was always in the top 10. Now we have a policy shift in Sweden, and the experts really fear that Sweden will drop its performance and will have a worse performance and therefore could drop in the next year's ranking. We have interesting results regarding the United States and Australia. The good thing, in both countries went up a bit in this year's CCPI because of policy change. The difference here is that the policy change in Australia didn't go so far until now. We have better targets and we have a better policy evaluation. However, there is no implementation package on the way now. So this is the next step that needs to be done. And this is the difference to the US. We